Okay, welcome to the first of our Newcastle Youth Studies Centre seminar series for 2025. Um, Obviously, Threadgold, the director of the centre, and today we're joined by an illustrious crew of experts on automating everyday life. So we're being joined by Phan from UQ, Nicholas Carah from UQ, who's also co-authoring with Lauren Hayden, and Joel Stern from RMIT. And Tao's also doing her paper with Fabian Offert from the University of California. To begin with, I'd like to acknowledge we're meeting on the lands of the Awabakal and Worimi peoples on this campus and University of Newcastle. We pay respect to elders past and present, and I would also like to acknowledge and pay our respects to our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander First Nations peoples who may be joining us on the Zoom today. So just very quickly, we're running this series out of the Research Centre that myself, Julia Coffey, Julia Cook, Caitlin Molliker, and Vanessa Bowden are part of. I suppose we're interested in kind of branching out in our interests a little bit, but I think all the topics that we're doing over the six seminars are still quite youth related. And so we're going to start today with a very important topic, I think, that kind of is relating to some of the research we're doing at the moment on fintech, on automating, on different aspects of automation. So we're going to start with Thao. It's a slight change to the program. Who was last in the list online, but she's got to go early. So Thao, do you want to get started and share your screen?
Oh,
Thanks.
thank you. Uh, cool. Can you see my slides okay? Yep, great. And got my cheeky notes. Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, Steve. And thanks for everyone for joining me. So my name is Thao Phan. I'm actually based at ANU in the School of Sociology there, and I'm presenting this paper alongside Dr. Fabian Offert, who's based at UC Santa Barbara and couldn't be here, but is here in spirit and in our hearts. So I'll start by acknowledging that I'm joining today from the lands and waters of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, and to pay my respects to elders past and present, and to extend that acknowledgement to any Indigenous people who are joining us here today. This land was never ceded to the Crown and remains a continued site of care, custodianship and resistance. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. So I'd like to flag that this presentation will touch on the topic of political violence. And as a quick content warning, I'll say that it does contain images of violence and of suffering and deprivation against racialized people, specifically refugees. These are not real images in the sense that they are all AI generated, but that of course doesn't make them any less distressing. I'd also like to flag that all the words, ideas, everything that I'm presenting today is the result of a collaboration between myself and Dr. Fabian Offert. Over the last few years, we've been thinking a lot together about the impacts of machine learning on visual culture. Fabian is someone who has a background in art history, media theory, and media arts practice, and myself is someone who is in feminist STS and who thinks a lot about gender, race, and algorithms. And this is still very much a work in progress. So please, if you have any feedback, we would love to hear it. Okay, so let's begin. Are some things unrepresentable? Asks a 2011 essay by Alexander Galloway. This provocation responds to an earlier text of the same title by the philosopher Jacques Rancière on the problem of representing political violence. Rancière approaches this question from an aesthetic perspective, using the Holocaust as its anchor point. What precisely is being said when it is maintained that there are certain entities, events, or situations that cannot be represented by artistic means, he asks. From this question follows a crucial insight about the relation of form and content, namely that the exceptional event neither prescribes or proscribes any artistic means. Its unrepresentability is a function not of its exceptionality, but of our expectation that art will make even the most extreme forms of human experience intelligible, while upholding a meaningful correspondence between form and content. That there must exist an appropriate form in which the exceptional event can be represented, such that it can be grasped in its entirety. In his own text, Galloway takes up Rancière's discussion of a dialectics of unrepresentability and reframes it as a media philosophical question, focusing on the opacity of data and the moribund aesthetics of the information society. Taking aim at the phenomena of the data visualization, he argues that data reduced to their purest form of mathematical values exists first and foremost as number. And as number, data's primary mode of existence is not a visual one. In short, data have no necessary visual form. This insight, however, conflicts with the reality of data visualization, where adherence to aesthetic conventions is so extreme that, for instance, only one visualization has ever been made of an information network. The synthesis for Galloway lies in the acknowledgement that the conditions of production determine the question of representation almost entirely. Too much intellectual effort is spent on the question of the unrepresentability of power and violence, and not enough is spent on the question of the unrepresentability of the conditions of production from which this violence emerges in the first place. So in my contribution in the seminar, I'd like to invite us to consider the problems and paradoxes of unrepresentability within this contemporary AI art moment. And I'd like us to consider two AI art projects. So the first project is Exhibit AI, created by the law firm Maurice Blackburn in collaboration with the advertising firm Howitson and Company, which focuses on the experiences of asylum seekers incarcerated on Nauru, Manus Island, and Christmas Island. It uses image generation models to create images from witness testimonies of the refugee men and women who suffered extreme trauma as a result of Australia's inhuman policy of mandatory detention and offshore processing. Let me play for you the short film that accompanies the project, which includes many of the AI-generated images and provides insights into its motivations.
I witnessed a man burning himself to death.
I had a very young baby. He was witness with the suicide. He was witness with everyone screaming. He was witness with everyone fighting.
He put his hand over my mouth. He then raped me.
I was worried some things will happen. I live in fear of violence and abuse. I came by boat because my country was so dangerous for me. I just want to be able to live my life.
Photojournalism is so raw and visceral. The heart of this project is making sure that these witness statements are honoured and have the impact that they deserve.
So the second example that I would like to talk about is Calculating Empires, a genealogy of power and technology 1500 to 2025, a collaboration between critical AI scholar Kate Crawford and designer Vlad Anjola. Those familiar with Crawford and Anjola's previous work, Anatomy of an AI System, will recognize this method of large-scale mapping as a means to give visual form to the invisible networks of power, labor, extraction, control, and so forth that underpins AI systems. The project's self-proclaimed goal is to take Donna Haraway's provocation literally, that we need to map the informatics of domination, and does so in the form of a giant room-sized diagram, which was first publicly shown as an exhibition piece at the Fondazione Prada in Milan in November 2023. I'm going to read a bit from the introductory essay. So Calculating Empires is a large-scale research visualization exploring how technical and social structures co-evolved over 5 centuries. The aim is to view the contemporary period in a longer trajectory of ideas, devices, infrastructures, and systems of power. It traces technological patterns of colonialism, militarization, automation, and enclosure since 1500 to show how these forces still subjugate and how they might be unwound. It centers on 4 themes: communication, computation, classification, and control. Across the centuries, the work illustrates the shifts in communication devices, infrastructures, and computational architectures, and how they are entwined with the histories of social control and classification. The vertical axis represents time, beginning with the 16th century at the base. The horizontal axis features a collection of systems, from algorithms to architecture, bodies to borders. Navigation is flexible. You can follow a theme, a time period, or a set of ideas. So, on the surface, these 2 projects could not be more unlike. The first using AI to create photorealistic depictions of political violence as a form of ersatz visual evidence, and the second using more or less traditional forms of data visualization and information aesthetics to render visible the socio-technical underbelly of artificial intelligence, its historical and political dependence on systems of power and exploitation. And yet, through the lens of Rancière and Galloway's discussion of unrepresentability, their commonalities start to become apparent. So first, both artworks start from the proposition that there are some things that are unrepresented. In the case of Exhibit AI, the prohibition on phones, cameras, and journalists inside of offshore processing facilities has resulted in a lack of visual evidence of the injustice inflicted on refugees. This lack is ostensibly what prevents the arrival of justice, an unrepresentability that results from the material arrangement of regimes of border control that by their nature function to exclude and repress. In the case of Calculating Empires, it's the sheer vastness and complexity of networks of violence and power that make them near impossible to portray in full, an unrepresentability that is symptomatic of an aporia of scale. So both use AI, though in very different ways, to solve the problem of representability. While Exhibit AI is determined to solve Rancière's version of the problem by appealing to an entirely new medium, a new visual form, that is image generation, Calculating Empires is determined to solve Galloway's version by going all in on the traditional means of data visualization, as if to suggest that previous attempts have just not gone far enough. But what is ironic is that the medium that they've used to solve the problem of unrepresentability is itself unrepresentable. So what do I mean by this? So here we're following a thread laid down by theorists such as Harun Faraki, Trevor Paglen, and most recently Jussi Parikka, who argues that many images today no longer function as indexical, circulating within the realm of the representational or the pictorial, but instead operational. Operational images trouble what an image is, states Parikka, as far as it shifts from representational to non-representational, from the primacy of human perception of bodies, movement, and things, to measurement, pattern analysis, navigation, and more. There is no longer to riff on Flusser, the improbable image. These are not to riff on Flusser, the improbable images that have not been seen before, but images that we've endlessly witnessed. As Eric Salvaggio notes, every AI-generated image is an infographic about a dataset. Yet at this moment, we see a turn to using AI images, arguably the most operational image, to do representational work, right? And not just any representational work, but the most politically difficult representational work to do. That is, to represent problems of violence, of power, suffering, exploitation, and so on. The limits of both projects, we argue, can be understood through the critiques introduced by Rancière and Galloway. So Exhibit AI. There's a few reasons why I think this project is quite jarring. And I think the first is that the central proposition that there is an absence in the visual record of crimes in offshore detention is simply not true, right? There are endless testimonies from the people who have witnessed and lived the trauma inside. There have also been many efforts to record and broadcast their stories. So the Manus Recording Project Collective comprises 4 hours of audio recordings made inside of Australia's hotel detention regime. Throughout August of 2020, subscribers could receive a text message with the new 10-minute recording along with their distance from the recording's maker. And the result is a rare sonic archive of hotel detention. Likewise, Behind the Wire is an oral history project documenting the stories of the men, women and children who have been detained by the Australian government after seeking asylum in Australia. And this project was translated into a podcast, an exhibition, as well as a book. And one extraordinary example is a film called Choka, Please Tell Us the Time, made by journalist and Manus Island detainee Behrouz Bashani in collaboration with the filmmaker Arash Kamali Savastani, composed of mobile phone footage smuggled out of Manus by Bashani. So what can we say about this? Well, I think first and foremost, this approach completely misdiagnoses the lack. Right? The lack is not a lack of visual evidence, but rather a lack of political will to do something about it, to end the suffering now. So instead of reading the appeal to AI as a means to compensate for a lack, to fill a void with synthetic images, we might instead read this through the lens of Ranciere's aesthetic theory to say that the use of AI is the result of a search for a sublime form, a sublime art that is adequate to the task of representing sublime suffering. The irony is that this particular medium of art literally cannot be used to represent violence or suffering because the images that are produced are explicitly non-representational and cannot point to an unrepresented otherness, because at this moment in time, all AI art can represent is itself. As the composer and writer Jennifer Walsh writes, right now in late 2023, when she's writing, we are still at the point where art made with AI is art about AI. Art about the fact that it's impossible to make art with AI. By this, I mean that most artworks being generated using AI don't make sense, are not completed, unless the viewer or listener understands that they have been made with AI. Artworks may be critical of AI or touchingly utopic. They may serve a pedagogical function or be crassly exploitative. They may illuminate universal truths or appeal to the lowest common denominator. They may even be regarded by their creators as having nothing to do with AI, other than the fact that they were produced using AI. What they have in common is that they are works of conceptual art. AI is the concept. And with calculating empires, it also wants to show you suffering. It also wants to show you the power and violence. But in practice, all we see are abstract connections. So I'd like to take a moment to read Alexander Galloway's critique of data visualization, and in particular, his reading of a complicated PowerPoint slide of an American military strategy. And I'm going to substitute the word PowerPoint slide for map to show how this critique holds perfectly for this example. So he says, despite an overwhelming amount of detail, the map is not easy to digest. In fact, the high level of detail seems to hinder comprehension rather than aid it. Unlike realism in painting or photography, wherein an increase in technical details tends to bring a heightened sense of reality, at least in the traditional sense of aesthetic realism that has held sway more or less since the Renaissance, the high level of technical detail visible here overwhelms the human sensorium, attenuating our sense of reality. Rather, like a fractal whose complexity does not decrease when viewed through a magnifying glass, the information contained in the map does not grow more coherent the longer one inspects it. Eschewing lucidity, the diagram withdraws from the viewer's grasp, effectively neutering its capacity as a vehicle for information. So I put it to you that unless I told you that this was a map of technology, power, and AI, you would not know what it was. That this could easily just be a map of the making of a croissant, a visualization of all the forms of colonial power, labor, and extraction that it takes to make a sandwich. In short, in trying to represent everything, it represents nothing at all. So at a time when images are said to no longer be representational but operational, when vision has given way to the invisual, both pieces recenter the primacy of the human eye, appealing to the aesthetic language of the visual in order to prosecute the case for justice. And I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Thao. That was great. So do we have a question at this point that we could ask from the crowd? Maybe put it in the chat. Mhm. I'll ask you to expand a little bit on the kind of point you were making at the end there. Point about how I think what you said was that the point of those things is AI. That can't really escape. The thing making it is the point, and kind of
Yeah.
vice versa. Can you expand a little bit on kind of what you mean by that, and maybe more so the implications of it?
Yeah, I suppose I'm trying to make a point around like why are we using AI to try and solve whatever we think the problem is here,
Yeah.
right? When right now, um, I mean, what's really interesting in some ways is that like I kind of feel like AI is still sort of like a solution fumbling to like find
Its problem. Yeah.
its problem, specifically generative AI. And so I've seen sort of quite a lot of these kinds of examples of, artists in particular who are using generative AI to sort of create sort of synthetic images that in some way are supposed to represent sort of an absent visual record. I've seen sort of, I can't remember the name of it now, but like particular artists who have had their own refugee or migration story, and they've sort of made images to sort of feel like what could have happened, had I had a childhood that was not displaced. We have this example where, what's happening here, why aren't we allowed to see? And it's like this appeal to human vision as the thing that will like deliver justice for us, which is sort of insulting insofar as, we have a lot of testimony from Manus and Nauru and from refugees themselves already, but what is it that AI can do that the testimonies from the human bodies cannot do? And maybe some of that has to do with the fact that like it's too difficult to look directly at images of violence. We look particularly in this moment around Gaza, where there are so many AI images coming out there, Ukraine and so on. And I think there is like a particular kind of trauma fatigue when it comes to looking directly at images of violence, such that the only sort of bearable forms of images we can sort of tolerate are synthetic ones, because we know they're not real bodies on the line, even though they gesture to a real violence happening elsewhere. But at the end of the day, I feel like, AI can't actually tell us something we don't already know about what is happening. It's an interesting sort of like ploy or sort of something that like AI can solve this for us, when actually all our political lobbying up until this point has not been able to.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is that there's like more actual images of the violence available to us through our social media than ever before.
Yeah.
Kind of happening live as well at the same time while it's being produced. Yeah. Yeah, the solution without a problem kind of thing is interesting in the sense that all the kind of technological stuff reminds me of that, like Elon Musk wants to build a tunnel to put cars through underground. It's like, oh, look, they've discovered trains, like, like, so, okay. There's one question there, because you was so timely, there's a little bit more time, so I'll ask this question as well. This is from Caitlin, do you know what the public or government response, if any, has been to the projects? Have they had any kind of effective impact?
I guess it depends what you mean by effective, insofar as people
Affect, yeah.
well, insofar as people like still live in detention, have what has the impact been? Have people been moved? Surely, yes. How can you witness any of these stories and not be moved? But do we still have like a violent regime of detention and border control? Yes, we do. And do we have other countries also seeking to reproduce, to replicate the exact forms of control that Australia has? Yes, we do. So at this stage, I presented this elsewhere, and people were very like, at this stage, anything you can throw at it, anything you can at this problem is worthwhile doing. Our intention is not really to critique, to take down like, oh, this isn't the way to do it. Because at this stage of the refugee crisis, it's like anything is worth doing. And in that sense, it's like, maybe this is like the one moral use of like generative AI, if it could make any difference in this debate whatsoever.
Great, thanks. Joel's our next speaker. Do you want to ask a question while you're set up, Joel?
Yeah. Oh, am I going next? I thought Nick was going next,
Oh,
but
sorry, Nick's going next. Oh, sorry.
yeah.
Sorry. Sorry.
So that's okay. But that was great, Tao. That was really excellent. I just had a couple of quick thoughts. Obviously the Morris Blackburn example is
Yeah.
sort of in the legal register first and foremost, and then it sort of moves over into the art space somehow, and it's kind of like, forensic architecture and other sort of projects in that sense. And I'm just wondering whether the, use of AI in that instance is sort of overdetermined by this idea of the production of evidence, and that that the evidence should sort of be perfect and optimized, and sort of impactful in ways that benefit from it being kind of hyper real. Um, and then just standing up for the Kate Crawford, Vlad and Jola work a little bit, because I had the same um, kind of intuitive reaction to it as you did, and until I saw it in person. And when I experienced it in the museum, the scale of it and the capacity to actually spend time and kind of move around the work and take the time to focus in on various parts of it over a longer period, it became a lot more legible to me. Like, it definitely didn't feel like a map of, croissant making. I know that was a sort of flippant example, but yeah, I wonder if one of the things that spaces like museums and artworks do allow is for that level of concentration and focus that we don't traditionally bring to AI generated media, because it's so disposable and instant. So just standing up for that work in the sense that its strategic placement in an art context is a way to say, spend time with it, stand in front of it, move through it, and kind of take seriously its potential as a pedagogical work.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, all I'll say on the first point, like it starts with a law firm, but then it actually goes to an advertising company. So the degree to which this is art is actually, I think, up for grabs. Like, it looks like art, it gestures to art, it's displayed as an exhibition, and then goes into an art book. But then at the end of the day, it's supposed to be delivered back to politicians. And so, if anything, it's more an advertising campaign than it is an artwork. And that's often bared out the only other times I've presented this has been to like art audiences, and none of them have heard of this before. And I think it's because it's actually not for artists. It's not for the art community. It's not to be circulating inside of the economy of art. It doesn't have that label, even though it resembles it in many ways.
Mm.
It's a piece of strategic communication in the sense of advertising.
Yeah.
And the only last thing I'll say is I also saw it in a gallery, which is where I first saw it, and I did not have that experience. I didn't enjoy it, but that's fine. Yeah.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Thao. Really appreciate that. So we'll move on now to Nicholas, who, if you want to share your screen.
Yep, thanks, Steve. I'll just give
Yeah.
a sec here.
Who is talking about promotional culture, automated loops and sequences.
All right, can you see me on full screen there?
Yes.
Cool. Awesome. Thank you. Thanks, Tao and Joel. It's great to be presenting, and for the invitation, Steve. I feel sitting between Tao's talk on art and Joel's talk on art that I'm like the ad break, literally talking about ads in the middle. So I'm going to be talking about a bigger project. But firstly, of course, I want to acknowledge as well that I'm talking today from unceded Yagara and Turrbal land, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. This project is part of a much bigger project. So I just wanted to acknowledge that much of what I'm talking about draws in very interconnected collaborative ways with a very large team in the ARC Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision Making in Society. And within that centre, the Australian Ad Observatory project, which has been running for a few years now and will run for a couple of years more. There's a photo on screen here of a number of us in that project. So just acknowledging that this work really comes out of that larger effort. And part of the work I'll talk about today is from a linkage project that I've been working on the last couple of years that's involved Amy Dobson and Brady Robards as fellow CIs. And also Lauren Hayden has worked on that project as a PhD student. Lauren's unable to join us this afternoon. We hoped we'd be able to do this together, but she's unable to join us. So a number of people who've informed this work. I wanted to, though, in the talk kind of think conceptually about, as we've been exploring these projects over the last couple of years, promotional content, advertising, and the way they flow in our digital feeds, how bit by bit we're trying to think conceptually about it that might take us beyond the established or simple kind of understandings of, say, targeted advertising that we have in mind. So I'll tell you a little bit about how the projects work and their methods, and then kind of get into this conceptual idea of sequences, loops, tuning, and try to explore what might be at play in these concepts. And I guess my provocation and question for everyone is, I'm interested in how people may or may not find them useful, or press back on them, or respond to them. So in these projects, we're kind of thinking about this problem of that promotional culture and advertising on digital platforms presents us, which that it's become dark in the sense that advertising has moved sort of out of the public as a public form of culture, and now kind of flows inside our very kind of individualized feeds on the digital apps that we're scrolling through. And so, you know, the advertising remains a mass cultural form in the sense that we all experience it every day, but it kind of disappears and becomes a private experience, as in my particular sequences of ads that I see. And so in both these projects, we're exploring ways to even find and observe advertising. And to do that, one of the premises in our research designs is to work with people, that people help us find it by either quite proactively screenshotting it and sharing it with us, or in the case of the Australian Ad Observatory study, installing an app on their phone that sits there in the background, scanning as they use social media platforms, snipping the ads out of their feeds, and then donating them to us. So this little visualization on screen is the app we use in the Ad Observatory, and you can see in that scrolling GIF as the ad moves across the screen, our model clips out a number of frames of that ad and donates that to us. In the linkage study, we had young people in Brisbane, Melbourne, and Perth work with us over the course of a month, screenshotting examples of alcohol advertising they were seeing, and nightlife promotion they were seeing, and saving that and sharing that with us, and then co-analyzing it with us in an in-depth interview. So in these projects, we're trying to get beyond just, if you like, the ads, to think about larger social and cultural questions about advertising and promotional culture on platforms that are more like, what is the larger pattern of advertising or pattern of promotional culture that we see in our feeds, and how might we think of that as shaping a larger promotional culture that we live in, and that may or may not kind of correspond with our subjectivity or subject position over time. So what we kind of encountered in these projects over a number of years, and I would say the first project where I really started to think about this was a project that Brady and Amy and I did with Vic Health, where we had young people screenshotting alcohol, gambling, and fast food ads, and we kind of started thinking about what to do with, say, a collection of 5,000 screenshots. So in the linkage project, again, we have 4,000 screenshots, and it's like, what to make of these ads that people have sent us. And as we started kind of qualitatively coding them and thinking about them, what we began to notice at the level of individual participants is that some participants' collections of ads were like quite aesthetically or semiotically coherent and different from their peers. And so you could start to think about the overall meta-narratives or themes or patterns that were happening inside people's collections. And then in the Ad Observatory, when we worked on phase 1 of this study, we had a collection of ads that was, in the region of, oh gosh, I'm having a bit of a mind blank here. But I think in the region of 700,000 ads. And again, that was just like a really big computational problem. And they'd been donated by 1,900 participants. And we had this kind of moment where we started to say, actually, the thing to think about here is not, we have hundreds of thousands of ads. but we have 1900 sequences of ads that some individuals have seen. And so in one of our early workshops, this is what I've got on screen here, this slide is a bit of a kind of a foundational little visualization in the Ad Observatory project for all of us that we use a lot. Where we started to think about, like, if what you're seeing on screen represents, say, the hundreds of thousands of ads that any of us could be recommended or targeted with anytime we log on to TikTok or Instagram or Facebook or anywhere else on the internet. And then what the algorithmic model is doing is kind of producing a path through the ad space for each of us. So this might be you, and this might be me, and this might be someone else, and so on. And the thing for us to start thinking about is the kind of technical and social production of that sequence of advertising, that sequence of ads and promotional content. And so this kind of really, over the last couple of years, we've been trying to think about, the sequences that make up advertising and promotional culture, but maybe also the algorithmically sequenced nature of digital platforms, more generally, perhaps as well, as a kind of the key object to study. And I think to kind of simplify, one of the things I really take from Louisa Moore, the sequence is the thing the algorithmic model produces in the world. It's the thing we can apprehend, the output of the model, and then we can think about what it, how it's made, and then also what kinds of effects it might have in the world and in our lives. So I want to, if that's the sequence as a basic idea, I then want to kind of iterate that one step further by thinking about this concept of loops, because one of the things that Lauren and I started to think about with the Linkage project was that a sequence implies a certain kind of linearity that, I might start, using a social media platform in the mid-noughties, and then over the course of 20 years of my life, see a very long linear sequence of ads. But actually the way that ad models work and the way consumer culture works is that it's very kind of repetitive. And the experimental nature of the ad model means that they're trying out certain ads and then looking for what works and kind of repeating the pattern and refining the pattern. And so, of course, one of the things that really that might be obvious to you already in this sense of sequences, loops, tuning is these are very kind of sonic or musical concepts. And for me, the link between sequences and loops and the drum machine or the sequencer is really kind of constantly in my mind here. And I kind of almost like visually think about patterns of ads now in the way I think about the almost like what it's like to muck around with programming a sequencer or a drum machine, and you're looking for and refining and iterating patterns all of the time. We kind of, as we've been sort of exploring this concept and thinking about I don't know, when you're like drawn to a particular word descriptively to describe some data you're working with, you start thinking about who else might have been doing that and what the deeper currents of it might be. And when we were prompted actually by Adam Arvidsson to present at a workshop he organized, looking back at 20 years of critical work on branding, Lauren and I both discovered in Adam's work and in Celia Lurie's work way back in the mid-noughties. Can you say way back in the mid-noughties now? I guess you can. That they in an interesting way already had this sense as digital media and digital cultures were really emerging in the way that we understand them now, that brands are already beginning to function as loops, as ongoing iterative processes of refinement, differentiation, tuning, and so on, that they were programmatic in a sequenced and looping or iterating kind of a way. So to kind of bring this idea of the loop back to some of the data we've been working with, this study, as I mentioned briefly before, has involved 30 young people who are kind of key informants who work with us screenshotting alcohol and nightlife promotion for 30 days. And then at some point during that month, they recruit 2 friends who join them over the course of a night out or a weekend screenshotting things together. And then we do both an individual and a group interview. The individual interview kind of co-analyzing the month of screenshots, and the group interview kind of looking at their collections of screenshots in relation to each other and thinking a kind of comparative dynamic between each other. One of the things we began to notice as we were doing this, we were very deliberate in this study to take to let participants themselves define advertising and promotion. And it's been really helpful for us in kind of elaborating, particularly in reference to the Ad Observatory study, where we're so focused on advertising as a formal category, to kind of elaborate this whole universe of other sorts of proliferating promotional forms and formats that are going on in people's feeds. And the way that formal targeted advertising, creator content, things made by venues, things made by creators who are kind of sitting at the boundaries or at the crossovers between the promotional and the creative, all blur together in people's feeds and are sequenced or looped together in interesting ways. What we then began to notice as we started to follow particular kinds of brands is that brands show up in different ways in different people's feeds, and then you might say can like take on different sorts of meanings in people's feeds. So here's Aperol Spritz 4 different ways, if you like, and just to pull out a couple of kind of examples of it with Sam down the bottom right. The kinds of screenshots Sam was sharing with us were very much attuned to their nightlife experiences and interest in going out to see live music. And so they see Aperol showing up in their feed as part of a kind of collaboration between the touring company Live Nation and Aperol, the alcohol brand. Whereas if you see Jackson above, Jackson's like a young guy, he's seeing lots of kind of alcohol related memes and brand merchandise. And Aperol Spritz shows up in this kind of janky drop shipping Aperol sweater, and that's obviously, well, it's not an Aperol ad, but it's like a kind of slightly scammy adaptation of brand merchandise that's going on in his feed. And so here, this kind of overlap between the formal advertising of the brand and the larger informal, darker, sketchier universe of promotional culture kind of comes to the fore in Jackson's collection. Carl, though, you see a much more, I guess, what we might expect for Aperol Spritz to kind of show up as part of a collection of ads and promotional material about nightlife and cocktail venues and so on. And so we're interested here in these kind of intersections and the ways that brands kind of arrive in different loops in different ways. And so the brand can then take on certain kinds of connotations in different kinds of collections. To kind of then get at one more concept here, or one more way of thinking about loops, is that if we look at these 4 collections, and just thinking here, one brand showing up in different collections in different ways, then the sequences of ads people see, we can start to think of as these series of ongoing kind of experiments, this recursive testing of ads, formats, creative, towards some kind of an objective. And in this kind of visualization, what we're trying to think about is how, you might see a sequence of ads, and then however you interact with it will affect over time the next kind of sequences you see, this kind of constant tuning of the sequences over time. And so this is a very kind of looped process. And then those loops are playing out in relation to your kind of space or your kind of positioning in the latent space of the ad model. In a sense, your loops are being informed by who you're proximate to around you. And so there are kind of things feeding into the looping of your ads and the promotional content that you're seeing that are kind of spatially influenced by who the model thinks you're proximate to, given the kinds of things you're kind of dwelling on, engaging with, the ways you're moving around the world, and so on. So we're trying to think here of how to kind of deepen our sensibility of what it is that automated advertising models make, and to shift away, I think, from focusing on the targeting of a specific ad or the use of data to target us in a particular moment in time, and to sort of think about the way that automated models produce these looping, iterating sequences of ads that interplay with our lives and subjectivities in kind of complicated ways. And for that to be the thing that we're trying to, at one level, empirically describe, and at another level, then theoretically and develop a critical account of in order to kind of think about what the social power of advertising is, beyond just the things we've been really interested in the last couple of decades. On the one hand, a much more promotional culture full of influencers and so on. On the other hand, a much more powerful targeted advertising model. To kind of think about the larger, to go back to an old term in critical cultural studies of advertising, larger cultural surround of advertising, the larger social work that it's doing, and to think about these loops as the thing that the ad model makes, and therefore the kind of device or technique of advertising that's kind of having a larger social effect now, or where to go look if we want to look and think about the power of advertising in the present moment. And then maybe just to end on one other concept is to say that we, in some of my other work before this, trying to think about just shifting the terminology from targeted advertising to tuned advertising. And this is obviously in many ways indebted to Thao and Scott Walk's essay as well, that rather than think of advertisers as entering explicit targeting criteria, what's underpinning all of this is an ad model that's much more associative, much more proxy-based, much more interested in the shaping of kinds of patterns and loops and sequences over time. I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. Something's happened weird in the chat where it seems to have gone out of order for me, so I can't see if people have typed in there now. So has anyone got a question for Nick at this point? Um, I'd like, well, can you tell us a little bit about your method with the app you're using to collect images of people's platform use and, picking up specifically aspects that you want from those platforms? How does that work?
Yeah, I guess there are kind of two methods that we've been using in different ways over the last 5 years or so, and the screenshotting method is very much getting the emphasis on letting participants sort of direct and decide what counts as promotional and what counts as advertising. And so you get this kind of broader sense of the promotional cultures people are embedded in, but it's sketchier and messier and less consistent and all of those sorts of things. The Ad Observatory study is very much focused on like the formal category of paid advertising. And in the first phase of the Ad Observatory, we were just collecting Facebook ads out of people's browsers. But in this second phase, and we've just gone into the field in the last couple of months on this, we have people install an app on their phone. It runs on Android phones and it collects uh, the ads out of their feeds from TikTok, YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram. And it does that by just taking a very low res screen recording when they open those apps. And then we have a very lightweight machine vision model on the phone that just then snips out the ads and donates them to us. And the participants can see in a little dashboard on the app the ads that they're donating to us, and they can choose to remove stuff if they want to. And then once we get those snips, we try to match them back to platform libraries of the real ads, and we add metadata to them by extracting information from the images and so on. So there's a lot of computational kind of methods in this study as well. But what I'm really excited about is we're about to go into the field then doing interviews with people where we show them the collections of ads that they've donated, and we co-analyze them together. And then we also make a move of showing them other people's sequences of ads and inviting that kind of comparison and reflection and thinking what it means for people to be able to see the relationship between, say, their sense of their subject position and their ads and other people's sequences of ads.
Okay. And are you still looking for testers for your methods in your...
Yeah, so these methods are also part of a national research infrastructure project at the Australian Internet Observatory. And so if anyone's interested in these tools and methods, that our brief is very much to kind of make them more broadly available to researchers in the field. and even over time to kind of expand this method beyond just the particular use case of advertising. So yeah, if you're curious about this, you have ideas about this, I'm certainly be very happy to talk to people about it.
Joel, you got a question?
Yep. That was lower hand. Here we go. There we go. That was great, Nick. So I love the section on sequencing and looping and sort of playing ads as if they're a drum machine. I just one of my favorite conference moments of recent years, I think it was the ADMS conference a year or two ago, where you had the Ad Observatory panel, and
Yeah.
and there were members of the advertising industry sector there, and I had the feeling that you were, critiquing targeted advertising online, and they were sort of promoting it in the
Yeah.
same panel, and it even got to sort of targeting people with alcohol ads, at particular times when they were most vulnerable and so forth.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I just wondered if you had could say anything about the reception of this research within the advertising industry, or whether this has a sort of a regulatory dynamic, or what yeah, the research might do at that level of transforming the industry or challenging it in some way.
Yeah, I think that the one of the interesting things in the project is that the more you do it and have those kind of exchanges with the industry, the more you discover that there are then lots of complicated positions in the industry. Like, I mean, to talk about that, what was interesting at that ADMS symposium, that this interesting moment where we show a particular participant who saw like quite an extraordinary sequence of alcohol ads in a row, at 8 a.m. in the morning, and we were sort of pointing to some of the harms of seeing addicted, being targeted so heavily with addictive commodities. But the response of one of the advertising people on the panel was, well, we'd be concerned about this too, because if I was one of those alcohol brands, I wouldn't want my brand being swamped by all those other alcohol brands. And so, and it was just like one of those nice moments that highlights these different critical interpretations of the same object. And for them, what I find perhaps, maybe I wouldn't go so far as to say politically productive, but kind of interesting is how, to the extent that we as researchers often look to platforms as needing to demonstrate more observability, more accountability, and so on. Many in the ad industry feel much the same way, that these platforms are far too powerful, far too opaque, they're far too difficult to deal with. And a big kind of issue with the shift to a very proxy-based ad model is they've lost a lot of control over their own audiences, and their own audience building processes. And there's a real kind of critical concern about that in the ad industry. So I think, one of the interesting kind of discovery moments in doing this work, I think, is to discover all of those layers in the industry. And maybe just one other observation there is, talking to some creatives in the industry, they, their response to this sequences and looping idea is like, yeah, this is what we do when we're trying to think about a brand territory. We think of them as sequences too, and we're trying to arrange the sequences of images in order to think about what the perfect kind of aesthetic or semiotic tuning over time is that we want our brand to be a part of. So, I think anyway, you learn things like this about where your concepts make sense to the industry. Yeah, but there's also a larger regulatory critical agenda here as well, but I maybe won't get into that right now.
I thought for a minute there you're going to say that alcohol brands didn't want to be associated with problem drinkers. But
No, they
yeah,
definitely not associated with other alcohol brands.
So we've got time for one more question. So Pip's got a hand up. Do you want to ask one?
Oh, thanks. And yeah, I was just sorry. I'm in the rain trying to get my broken down car fixed, and so I'm very sad that I couldn't see your slides, Nick. But it was fantastic to hear, yeah, just about all of that research that you're doing. I wanted to ask about with that other age-old social science concept, power, and whether or not in the research with the young people, they talked at all about curation of their feeds in relation to advertising and how they do that and how they negotiate the ways in which the loops and sequences pan out for them across their platforms, and even in relation to others that they kind of share content with, and what that can tell us about sort of that dynamic between yeah, the platforms, the brands, and the people.
Yeah, thanks, Pip. It's because this is one of the things that we're really starting to think about, um, because I think in so far in the work, I guess what you discover when you go and do the interviews is that and this is not a this is not a new discovery in a sense that people have very rich sort of, I guess what you would call algorithmic imaginary. Do you know, like a sense of how their feeds are working and how things are attuned to them. Um, we were like, I mean, one of the things we've talked about a bit with Brady and Amy, because Brady really focused on a group of queer participants in Melbourne, and they had extremely kind of textured accounts of how their own subjectivity was reflected back to them in the advertising they were seeing, like how the alcohol and nightlife advertising clearly knew that they were queer. And um we were trying to think about whether that's like for particular identities, this is much more noticeable because you're much more and what might it be? Is it that you're more self-aware of your own positionality and so you notice it more, or when the ad model tunes into it, it separates from, I don't know, a dominant identity much more explicitly, and so you're therefore inclined to notice the model doing things to you. So I think sometimes, so we're trying to think about where to go with that in terms of thinking about power, because on the one hand, that's the model tuning in a very textured way, but on the other hand, when it does that, it produces a kind of richer more critical positioning in relation to it because you're kind of forced to think it through. Um, and then I guess to get to the thing that we're thinking about after that is, okay, it's one thing to observe people's kind of rich algorithmic imaginaries, but what might it mean then to, you know, convert that. I don't know if convert's the right word, but like enable or foster that in directions that are politically productive, and that are not, say, increasingly conspiratorial or mystical, or do you know, like, because you're seeing that kind of thing happen with the algorithmic imaginary broadly, where it produces these increasingly kind of mystical, fantastical kind of responses to the algorithm, which in some respects are very enjoyable and creative and everything, but in what ways might we also kind of use it to foster a kind of productive politics and, an everyday practices of observability that might actually be, meaningful and actionable for people in their lives?
Excellent. Thanks again, Nick. We'll move on to Joel now. So, Joel, can I get you to set up
Sure.
the screen, please?
PowerPoint.
Joel's going to be talking to us about degenerative music.
Okay. How's that? Can you see it?
Yep.
You got it? Okay. Thanks for having me here. Thanks to Thao and Nick for great presentations, and Steve for the invitation to speak. I'm on Wurundjeri country, unceded Aboriginal land in the northern suburbs of Naarm. In my studio at the back of my house, it looks like a Scandinavian sauna, Steve said, but it's less glamorous than that. And yeah, I pay respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I'm based at RMIT University in the School of Media and Communication, and I also acknowledge my collaborators, James Parker and Sean Dockeray, and the group Machine Listening that I work with. That all the ideas in this presentation really come out of conversations and collaborations with them. So this presentation is called Degenerative Music. It's very much informed by my background, which is in sound studies and experimental music traditions. And, they do really a person with a critical approach to AI generated music when you first encounter it. I'll frame the term degenerative music just in the first instance because I think that's important. It's not, so much about a failure of generativity, if this makes sense, but more a lens for noticing aberrations for what might normally be thought of as errors. So it's a way of thinking about sonic mutations, glitches, and unintended artifacts as being central rather than peripheral to a listening practice. And also, obviously, for the art historians in the room, degenerative art was a kind of way in which historically fascists talked about the avant-garde and its political challenges. I think it's important to mention at the outset that AI generated music is mainstream now. It's no longer a curiosity or a novelty in a way. Platforms like Suno and Udio that I'm going to talk about have millions of users, and they are really part of a kind of broader movement which is in the AI industry, which is around normalizing automated creativity. And I would also say, and using consumer culture as a way of reshaping notions of artistic production. Um, I'll go into this in more detail, but these platforms that I mentioned that are kind of enabling AI generated music, they make a promise based around sort of discourses of accessibility. What you hear time and again is you can make great music with no skills necessary, or even ideas necessary. And I think it's obvious to say, but we need to think about how these statements simultaneously democratize and impoverish musical engagement. And yeah, finally, I think, this question, what does it mean for music to become prompt-based and platformized? That's a really important question. I would argue that, um, these technologies do change the way that we value music away from authorship and originality, as problematic as those terms are, and towards, instantaneousness, personalization, and disposability. There's a joke in, these kinds of presentations that you have to mention Brian Eno, so I'll just get him out of the way now. But it is important to, say something about the history of generative music. It's a term that was commonly used in the 1960s and 70s to refer to systems that produce variation through rule-based processes. It's broadly part of conceptual art where there was an aesthetic and philosophical commitment to ways of generating art with the idea that the system or the concept was the engine of production rather than human control. Eno's ambient works, music for airports, other albums that you might have heard of, are an early model. There were so many groups that you could mention that were part of this movement. AMM, a really important one. For me, they were a free improvisation collective, and they talked about free improvisation as not only a model for civil society, but as a form of non-intentionality, right? So it's kind of like a precursor to, let's say, some of the generative systems we have now in certain ways. And also important to mention movements like algo rave and live coding, where there's a performance of improvisational coding that foregrounds human agency within the framework of computation. I'm not going to play any AMM. All of their albums go for, like an hour, and almost nothing happens until you sort of listen for some time, but do go and have a listen to them. So I'm just showing you here the interface of Suno, one of the key platforms for generative music. Here's the creation interface where you can choose styles of music, you can enter lyrics. It's prompt-based. It looks a lot like Midjourney and DALL-E and other platforms that you might be familiar with. Here's what happens to a song. Once you've generated it, you can sort of immediately upload it to platforms and look at it in a playlist. So there are a lot of things that are like new about AI generated music. If you want to draw a kind of rough through line from the generative systems that we talked about, in the introduction to the kind of generative music that we talk about in the context of AI, the first thing we'll say is that we're moved from sort of systems building to prompt engineering, right? And the prompt engineering happens in the context of black box AI. The systems that artists like Eno and AMM kind of built were what you could call sort of open source or informed by DIY ethics, as opposed to the opaque, proprietary platforms that we have now. Um, we can think about the change in the artist's role from composer to prompter, um, which is more broadly, about this shift in the mode of production from technical or musical skills to linguistic precision and algorithmic literacy. Um, we could also say that the artist is even less a prompter and maybe more like a consumer, because in these systems, consumption and production do collapse, right? You create something and then immediately you put it on a playlist and then listen back to it. And a lot of research shows that many pieces of generative music are made for an audience of one, the person that made it. So like this act of making and listening collapses into something like private self-satisfaction. We can also observe the platform aesthetics of, Suno and Udio. It's obvious they look more like Spotify than Ableton or other digital audio workstations. And that's a point that Eric Salvaggio makes, someone that Thao cited as well, that despite marketing themselves as tools for musical creation, Gen AI interfaces resemble streaming platforms first and foremost. Just looking at a couple of examples of AI music as conceptual art, Jennifer Walsh, who Thao cited as well, and Databots. Not to sort of repeat the point too much, but yeah, Walsh argues that in a lot of music and art, AI isn't a tool, it's the subject of the work. And she says that AI art is conceptual art and the concept is AI. But that this is something, that is sort of a historical moment that we're rapidly moving past. And I would sort of say that artists like like Jennifer Walsh and Databots, who we just saw here, who've generated a death metal live stream that's been streaming 24/7 on YouTube for the past few years, they do kind of represent this bridge between older forms of avant-garde generative music and new forms of automated music making. And it's a kind of avant-garde conceptual art moment in that space between. I'd also put my own work with machine listening, this album Songs About Fucking Suno, in that lineage as an example of auto critique of prompt-based music making. It's a collection of songs about deliberate copyright infringement, uncreative tactics, and forms of ironic, reflexive listening. You can listen to it on Bandcamp. For those who know, the reference is to, the classic Big Black album Songs About Fucking. Steve Albini, the person behind this group, was a pretty pioneering figure in the 1980s, critiquing the music industry from a sort of punk positionality with regards to labor exploitation and so forth. So we were thinking about how to, perform a similar kind of critique of the generative AI infused music industry to the one that to the traditional music industry that Big Black critiqued in this album. There you had a little glimpse of Velvet Sundown, a band who doesn't exist, but who nevertheless, have millions of listeners and fans who still like them, even though they know that they're now fake. I mean, I think there's a shift more broadly from the experimental to the indistinguishable, in which AI's increasing fidelity to commercial music dissolves what were previously clear distinctions between automated and human-made music. So another way of putting it is that in 2025, AI-generated music no longer announces its difference. Velvet Sundown is a really good example of that. As I said, they accrued millions of streams on Spotify before being outed as an entirely AI generated band, not just the music, but the press photos, the press releases, the whole history of the band's formation and everything. And many listeners didn't really care. They just kept listening to them, and that was fine. Um, I would say that good enough has become a feature of AI music. Good enough meaning good enough to pass as real. And obviously, we can start to see this as a problem that threatens collective musical practice and human intention with subsequent flow and effects for community building and cultural memory. I suppose the question is, um, what does it mean to listen to music made by no one, for no one, but for it still to feel like music?
We didn't just want to build, let's say, a company that makes the current crop of creators 10% faster or makes it 10% easier to make music. If you want to impact the way a billion people experience music, you have to build something for a billion people. And so that is first and foremost giving everybody the joys of creating music. And this is a huge departure from how it is now. It's not really enjoyable to make music now. People enjoy
Why did you say
Suno.
that?
It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of practice. You need to get really good at an instrument or really good at a piece of production software. I think the majority of people don't enjoy the majority of the time they spend making music.
Do you not think that's like running?
So yeah, it's not enjoyable to make music now. It takes too much time, takes too much practice, takes too much effort. That's the CEO of Suno, Mikey Schulman. And I was thinking about this. I was thinking about this as sort of anti-music, and also calling back to the Suno, marketing pitch that now everyone can make music, and the way in which that statement depends on, defining making music as not making music in a way. So, you, you know, um, I mean, the hubris of being so convinced by neoliberal instrumental logic that you would frame music making as tedious labor rather than joyful collective experience. Like, I'm sure I don't need to convince folks here, but just to say, music making has been pretty crucial to cultural connection, emotional expression, community identity, since the beginning of time, right? And it's often a byword for humanity in general. So, even though I don't think music making by humans is about to end, it is obvious that reducing music to instantaneous gratification does erase some crucial elements like struggle, vulnerability, experimentation, and so forth. And if you think about it, things like friction and effort and skill are precisely what makes music socially meaningful and culturally rich. I'll just mention Liz Pelly's, critique in this book, Mood Machine, on Spotify of what she calls perfect fit content, or sorry, what Spotify call perfect fit content, PFC, mass-produced music made by humans and AI. Sometimes it's ambiguous who made it, primarily for Spotify mood playlists. And Pelly emphasizes how PFC embodies the logic of platform capitalism. Music becomes a form of passive background consumption. And in a way, it's doing to the sort of radical ambient music of the 70s what generative AI does to the radical generative music of the 70s, kind of turning its kind of logic against itself. PFC is obviously cheaper than paying humans royalties to make music. Um, as Marek Pollock's pointed out recently in the Disintegrator podcast, music isn't Spotify's main asset. Music is Spotify's main cost, right? Because having reached peak subscriber rates, the best way for Spotify to increase profits is to pay less money to musicians by replacing music made by artists with AI and PFC content. So, we could think of perfect fit content and AI generated music as a kind of logical endpoint of frictionless algorithmic recommendation systems, leading us into something like fully automated sonic worlds full of platforms flooded with non-human content. There's a lot of research going on about how this is going to impact the music industry. These are my last couple of slides, Steve, in case you're getting worried. APRA AMCOS, the peak body for Australian musicians, released a report. 23% of music creators' income will be at risk by 2028, according to them. Generative AI threatens revenue systems by, obviously substituting original work for cheaper content. 89% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander creators were concerned about cultural appropriation because of AI. We know that AI systems amplify historical patterns of exploitation, extraction, and appropriation. 97% of respondents demanded policy intervention on AI and copyright in the music industry. But also, there were a kind of dual attitudes, excitement amongst some artists about AI's potential, as well as a kind of sense of existential threat. So you can kind of hold those two things together. So there's a tension at the heart of this technological shift. Um, so yeah, I guess some key questions that I've been thinking about. What kind of musical culture do we want to live in? I came up in kind of musical subcultures as a teenager that were grounded in collaboration, experimentation, cultural diversity, and so forth. So I would like to see these sort of safeguarded and be available to young people now. I also think, what does resistance sound like in a world of auto-generated content? Um, Sound studies offers a lot of strategies here for people who are interested in that discipline, critical listening, refusal of seamlessness, embracing things like the sonic uncanny, and insisting on music that is made in communal rather than algorithmically isolated contexts. Um, we can keep embracing and even sort of go looking for glitches, errors, and dissonances as sites of possibility and as techniques of reinstating human intentionality. And I know Thao's done a lot of really amazing work around misrecognition and in this sense too. And ultimately, I do think it's important that musicians, artists, and listeners try to reclaim music as situated and communal and as a political practice against the corporate logic of generative AI platforms. So, yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Thanks so much, Joel. That was really interesting. So yeah, it seems to be a reluctance to type questions into the chat. So if anyone has a question, please come forward. I mean, I suppose I could ask the most Gen X question ever, which is like, what does the concept of authenticity mean, like in terms of what you're talking about here? I mean, what you pointed to a minute ago there is kind of maybe a path to resistance in terms of maybe embracing glitches and stuff like that. I mean, AI kind of authentically produces glitchy, weird, haunting kind of mistakes and stuff, doesn't it? It's like, so what does all this mean in terms of that kind of well-worn concept?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, as someone grounded in sort of cultural studies and
Mm,
those disciplines, I know the notion of authenticity is pretty problematic. In fact, some of the best music critics talk about, glam as the most authentic musical subculture because it was the most upfront about its constructedness. Do you
mm,
know what I mean? So the way that glam artists like David Bowie and stuff rejected kind of hippie authenticity, kind
yep.
of paradoxically made them more authentic. So I'm not against constructed identities and all of those things, but I do think music made on corporate platforms sort of by no one for no one that floods the market,
Yeah.
does force us to think about authenticity in in new ways, probably in kind of broader ways. Yeah, the
Because
point
I
you
suppose like one of the
yeah.
things you kind of touched upon is like, yeah, we don't want to produce the kind of rockist kind of poptimist dichotomy with like, authenticity is dudes on guitars and like, electronic kind of pop music or whatever is not authentic.
No, not at all.
You
And
know,
yeah,
yeah,
I wouldn't want to argue that either. I mean,
yeah, yeah.
I think you know that one of the points I sort of tried to make in the presentation is that there is a trajectory towards seamlessness and banality and sort of good enough within AI music, so that the overwhelming majority of the music made using these systems will conform to genre sort of conventions and will be sort of largely homogenous. So,
Mm,
uh, the AI generated music that is glitchy, messed up, experimental, and hauntological, and so forth, it probably won't represent the broad practice of generative AI music
no,
making. It will be an experimental fringe.
yep,
Um, Nevertheless, um, music and musical trends, like all avant-gardes, often proceed through contradiction rather than continuity. Like one generation contradicts and subverts the conventions of one before, including its value propositions. So I'm sure musical subcultures will emerge out of Gen AI that it's super exciting and interesting. But
yeah,
I think I just wanted to give a broader sense of some of the problematics.
yeah. No, that's a great answer. Thanks. Nick?
Thanks, Joel. Anyway, I love listening to you talk about this stuff. And I just because you mentioned Liz Pelly's book, I'm reading it at the moment. I kind of it prompted two sorts of the book has been prompting a couple of questions for me, and I'm kind of interested to bounce them off you. But one way the argument goes is that Spotify needs to reduce the cost of music, and therefore you get perfect fit content. You can see how that leads to automated music next, and so on and so on. And I kind of wondered whether like the other way it goes, and a lot of these subscriber models are going is get people to subscribe, but then as engage with as little content as possible, and so that you generate as little licensing cost as possible. And like, how do you optimize for that? Um, I don't know. That's maybe more an observation. Gosh, I'm doing a comment and a question thing. But the question I have is like the other thing that keeps coming to mind for me is that what 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 do you make? I guess what Spotify highlights and is that much of our experience with music is kind of banal. It's not chosen and curated, the longer history of that is I don't know, like music in the shopping center and having the radio on while I'm driving the car or trying to go to sleep and whatever. And so and a lot so then it sort of makes sense that a lot of our uses of streamed and automated music just continue a lot of those very banal, almost like non-chosen, non-curated. And so like in kind of cultural studies, do we sort of overweight, or in popular music studies, do we kind of overweight the music fan in the record shop, really making these very curated choices and so on in the histories of the way we think about music. Anyway, I'd just be interested in your reflections on that.
Um, yeah, no, there's no doubt that the music industry has always tried to shape patterns of consumption and listening, and but within radio, for instance, there's the whole spectrum from community radio and college radio stations through to big commercial stations that traditionally had a payola system where the record labels would pay them to play their music. So there was that sort of diversity um, available. And I suppose the concern might be around, Spotify monopolizing the listening habits of a whole generation of people, or similar platforms that use algorithmic recommendation systems, that are opaque and that deliver AI generated content to listeners without any sort of context or knowledge for that. I mean, I think I sort of sometimes struggle with this research to balance a critique of what I would sort of see as generalizable observations about the most commercial and corporate parts of music making and distribution and consumption with my lived experience of being involved with music, which oscillates around record labels, community radio, concerts, and grassroots music cultures that are very resilient to these sorts of things. And we are seeing, quite a lot of bands opt out of Spotify now. I think it wasn't so much triggered by the economic exploitation model. It was more about Daniel Ek's investment in weaponized AI, maybe pushing people over a certain red line. Of course, it's often artists that have made a lot of money already, and who can afford to opt out. But yeah, I think to answer your question, discoverability has always been a very diverse kind of process for music. And what we're seeing with Spotify is the contraction of what is sort of discoverable, but not the eradication of like those other means of finding out about music, which is still thankfully available.
Tao?
Yeah, so good. I had a really similar question actually to Nick around like, does it tell us something about music that it's not really made to be listened to? Much in the same way, like I was chatting to a colleague recently about sort of generative AI, sort of revealing what is sort of this latent part of the internet, which is that most things are not meant to be read, most images are not meant to be looked at. The whole purpose of like all this content is that it's just made to circulate, right? And to do things like generate metrics for things like advertising,
Yeah.
to sort of bridge between some of these presentations, and that things like generative AI images and ChatGPT just expose this like particular thing that we have. Like my health insurer sends me newsletters, not because they have something to tell me and there's something to read, but because they want me to click on it for some reason, right? Because they want to be able to track and have all the cookies that go along with that. And so the content on there isn't meant to be read and the images aren't meant to be looked at. And whether this is sort of an interesting extension where like, it's in the lineage of like the contentification of sort of things or culture around us, that it's like music, as Nick said, like the majority of music that is just not meant to really be listened to, like it's just like background music for cafes. And again, Nick reminded me of sort of like the phenomena of Spotify Wrapped, and the majority of people, like the top 10 thing you listen to is white noise because you have insomnia. Or like your sleep podcast, because actually like the cultural condition of our time is that most of us like are overworked, and our brains can't rest at night because we have little like computers in our hands and screens in our hands or whatever. Just if you had sort of like thoughts on this, like revealing, I guess, like AI generated music as like revealing this particular tendency around music as content.
Yeah, I do think music has been radically devalued in certain ways. I sort of don't want to be too like I don't want to criticize the way that people younger than me listen to music, because there's a risk of well, the risk is obvious of like just being out of touch and not fully sort of understanding the complexity of it. But yeah, Marek Pollock's, who's super interesting thinker, who's got a book about to come out on Becoming Press called Exocapitalism, but he has a podcast, Disintegrator, and did a episode called No One Listens to Music Anymore. It kind of went, it followed the logic that you just outlined, Tao, and he talked about the emergence of two genres that will sort of replace all existing musical genres, and they were Spotify core and TikTok core. And Spotify core he defined as sort of like ambient background music that that is instrumental in the sense of helping you work, sleep, relax, or whatever. And TikTok core was sort of audio branding used to sort of sell, products or influence, on the sort of platform. And so, he's kind of accelerationist in a way, and also made the claim that Imagine Dragons are the most important band of the 21st century for the same reason. Um, and so this seems like a horror show to me. Um, but I don't want to be sort of techno-deterministic and sort of say that it's inevitability. But I do notice, yeah, for sure that there's been a radical devaluing of music, and that so much music now is instrumental, instrumentalized by capital in ways that we sort of couldn't have imagined prior to these platforms existing.
And yet probably more people are listening to music than they ever have before.
Yeah, but we might not call it listening or not even call it music, possibly. Yeah.
And I think that things like cultural sociology more broadly kind of aren't reckoning with this stuff at all. There's still the same kind of debates going on about genres and like certainly important things about whether artists get paid or not. But like the way that music has become data and now it's kind of crossing boundaries outside of culture and being used to decide who gets insurance or who gets access to a mortgage or a rental property is kind of definitely a thing that like cultural sociologists need to start reckoning with more. And I'm saying that because I'm writing a paper on it at the moment too, by the way. But like,
Yep.
yeah, see, Martin.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks very much for this presentation. I just wanted to talk a little bit about maybe collectively brainstorm ideas for resistance strategies, which I think are really important. Actually, I wanted to frame this question from my background of a music academic. I was actually late to this meeting because I was teaching a class, an undergraduate class, and the assessment we are currently working on is critiquing various forms of music AI. And many of the things that you have discussed, Joel, we've been actually talking in our class about those things in our class today. And what I think gives me a hopeful perspective is running that assessment for the last 3 years, talking about music AI for the last 3 years with undergraduate, up and coming new music creators. And it's really evident how they dislike and how they perceive AI music tools. So there's a clear resistance from those young musicians to engage with those tools, which I guess is an optimistic act of resistance. At the same time, I'm aware that I live in a sort of a bubble because I interact with those creatives a lot, and they are rejecting AI tools very clearly. However, lately, it seems like there's a bit of a perfect storm brewing because now those issues concerning streaming platforms, especially Spotify that you've mentioned, are also very much publicized. So I think maybe that would lead to the rejection of those connections between the AI industry and those giants such as Spotify and how they impacted the listening experiences that you were talking about. So on the one hand, I am observing a very positive signs of resistance and criticism coming from many practitioners who are music creators. But on the other hand, I would love to open up a conversation and ask for some more of your ideas on the acts of resistance and how to perhaps galvanize the community to be more aware. And I think other talks today, other presenters were talking about different angles of making the public aware. And I wonder what else can be done to increase the pressure and be a bit more effective in our acts of resistance.
I'd be happy to invite Thao and Nick to join too, and sort of attempting to answer that question because I think it applies to all of us, and the research we do and the pedagogy that we all do with students, and it sounds like you're doing a great class as well, Martin. So with music, it's probably a specific question as well related to music as an art form, because I think it's not surprising that people in your class who are critically engaged with music and who are probably musicians, in most cases, want to reject generative AI as a music making tool, I would say that musicians broadly are the ones that are most at risk, have the most fully formed critique, understand the absolute um, myopia of someone like Mikey Schulman claiming that music making, is unwanted labor and, could be easily replaced with an easier system. So it might be a question of how do we empower practitioners to transform the industry in ways that stem from, the knowledge and skill and value that they produce. But that's a bigger question for cultural industries more broadly because it would apply to writers and filmmakers and so forth equally. I try to do a lot of pedagogical work at the intersection of the university and the art industry. Like Thao and I were involved in a project called Data Relations Summer School and another project called Art, Race and AI, where we really specifically mapped out a few days to think, sort of brainstorm, do workshops and exercises, and to bring artists and researchers properly into conversation across disciplinary divides. And so I hope things like that are impactful. Um, I'm a bit skeptical about regulatory interventions. I know that they need to be made, but it just sort of seems like in the last few years, if we look at the radical transformations of these industries, that policy is always lagging behind, the technology companies, and or they're just not afraid to break the law, but basically, and deal with the consequences once they have transformed the sector in ways that there's no going back from. So yeah, I don't have a magic bullet, but I do think coming up as I have in underground subcultures that are DIY infused and critically and politically engaged, does at least arm me with some strategies and some lived experiences of how to operate outside of these extractive systems.
Mm.
I don't know, Tao or Nick, if
Yeah,
you.
Nick and Tao, do you have anything to kind of say, maybe not more generally about like maybe even what needs to be resisted? Because it's such a broad area of things that are being automated here.
The piece of it that I find myself thinking about a fair bit in relation to platforms is um, how much our political agenda gets shaped by the kind of combined civil society, government, policy machine that's sort of around us. And so, if you're studying advertising, then you get, you're drawn toward thinking about harmful commodities like alcohol and gambling, or if you're talking to government, you find yourself talking the language of observability and accountability and regulatory reform and so on and so on. And it's like, of course, not to say that these issues are not important, but that like what then creeps into the research intellectual project is that becomes the engagement translation end game, and does it stand in for the critical intellectual politics of the work overall? And so that I think that's the challenge that I find myself thinking about, and therefore thinking like what. So maybe not just to jump to resistance, but to say like, what would it mean to step back and say, what's the larger critical political intellectual agenda of doing work like this, that isn't just about the translation into the civil society, government, regulatory sort of agenda. And then at the same time, as I talked a little bit about when you're engaging with participants and you're trying to think about the everyday politics of, algorithmic literacies or everyday practices of observability and, those kind of, that again, we don't, that doesn't stand in either for like a critical political project. So it's like I'm trying to think about what might be in the middle level that's not like super about the micro everyday practices, but and not defaulting to the kind of policy context. I'm sorry, that's not an answer, but it's like the problem I find myself
Problem.
thinking about. But yeah, and the challenge I find myself confronted with, I suppose. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's totally I totally hear you. I mean, as someone who recently like put in an ARC grant for something, how quickly you fall into legible language of policy,
Right.
just for the pure purpose of like trying to get the money to then do what you want to do. Um, but I mean, yeah, I mean, I think this sort of question of like what needs resisting is really interesting, because in the examples that I was pointing to, they both are like they're works of resistance. And insofar as they gave me an occasion, or they gave us an occasion to sort of like continue to return to the politics of refugees, like they have been worthwhile in that sense. And so again, like my like it comes off as a critique, I think, when I present that work. But it isn't it's sort of it is an intention. It isn't the intention isn't to sort of like tear them down or sort of say that these are not worthwhile artworks or these are not, you know, you're not doing your politics right or what have you. It's like it's sort of pointing to sort of like an interesting irony of the way we incorporate these technologies into our acts of and into our political struggles. Uh, um, so it's a sort of a slightly different question in that sense. But I mean, when it comes to music, I mean, I don't know whether like I think we have no choice but just to make AI music like not cool. Like if we just have a bunch of boomers like dancing wildly to a Suno track, you know, and then it's just like, and then the next generation will not want to touch it. I don't know what kind of what other strategies could there possibly be?
Fortunately, it's Gen Xers doing all the stuff now.
Yeah.
Say that as one dude. Yeah.
I found it really interesting just to like revisit what you that video of the Suno CEO describing things as tedious, and showing the act and process of making music as tedious, because this is like the constant promise of automation is to take away tedious labor, no matter and you know, and my interest has a lot been in like what gets defined as tedious. And in the context of work I've done previously, it's like, you know, it's domestic work, it's secretarial work, it's like social reproductive labor is why you get digital assistants to come in and do certain things for you, like remind you to like book a restaurant and buy flowers for your wife on on your anniversary, is like the ads, the things they literally use to sell Siri with. And that's all tedious. That's all tedious labor. And I've also seen sort of like people talk about smart homes in this way. It's like, you know, your smart fridge can know what's inside of it and automatically order food and anticipate your menu items and a nutritious meal for your children. So you don't have to do that tedious labor anymore, and you can just spend time caring for your children, as if that work is precisely isn't care. And so it's so interesting to see it reproduced here, and what gets designated as tedious, as like the sitting with music.
It's a pretty big jump, though, isn't it, from like replacing the labor of like booking and reserving a table at a restaurant, or you know, ordering food from your fridge or whatever, and extending that logic to incorporate things like making music or making films or writing, that like that those would be considered purely as unwanted labor rather than
Yeah,
as like forms of meaning making. Like it's so hubristic.
yeah.
And
But this is what the discourse of automation, this is where it has led us, though. It's like it's the complete devaluing of labor, like full
Yeah.
stop.
right.
But it's also like the disconnection between identity and work, such that, you know, I mean, I had a really funny like encounter with a student who gave me a PhD proposal, which was completely AI generated. And I know this because it had cited work of mine that had been hallucinated, and and they were like, you know, your work has been so influential for me, especially this chapter. And I was like, I did not write that.
Yeah.
I did not write this.
I've had a couple of those emails this week.
Yeah, and it's sort of, and it's a kind of an interesting thing that a lot of us, if we work in institutions, are sort of having to deal with. Like reading is tedious, writing is tedious, and so what the hell are we all doing in institutions? But when I question them about it, and I was like, look, I'm sorry, I can't accept this proposal and I can't accept you as a student because I'm not interested. Like, when we're looking at proposals, we're interested in working with people who are to develop their ideas and develop their practices of writing. And I'm not that interested in working with like these pre-made ideas that come from a machine. And they replied and they were very insistent that their ideas were original, but they just took a shortcut to writing, and that was their mistake, and they apologized for that. But everything aside from that was original, was them, that, and so it was like a really interesting idea that you could sort of be an academic and be a writer and be a PhD student and have no relationship to writing as a labor, as a practice.
No, for sure. And I mean, obviously a lot of academics are using Gen AI as a shortcut in assessment and course making and so forth. And it has to be acknowledged that the neoliberal university imposes so much pressure on academics to overproduce that, and also forces you to find your own solutions to the problem of those unrealistic expectations. So, in other words, the problem of finding a way to get through all of your work falls on the individual, and therefore AI comes in as a solution to that problem. But I just think, from a cultural producer's perspective, if we automate the making of music, films, literature, and poetry, where does that leave us? Like we've much more time to do important things, like send emails, or do you know what I mean? It's like
it's the opposite of Marxist species being, right? It's like, it's like Marx would argue that we're all heading towards like creating more time to do all that beautiful stuff. It's like the AI is creating a situation to fill our time with more.
I don't think the AI is Marxist, no.
No, it's fascist. Yeah, yeah. Like I'm very much with Demical in there. Yeah. Tao, your example about like, the automation of, sending your wife flowers on her birthday, like is to me the perfect encapsulation of the logic of these things, right? The kind of tech bro logic of what needs to be replaced, and care in that sense is definitely one of those things. And I don't think it is a big stretch to kind of extend that logic to the way these people are oriented towards culture as well. It's for me very much a very similar kind of overlapping thing for sure. We've been doing some research at the moment. We've done a couple of workshops. I didn't do this one, but my colleagues were telling me about it on ChatGPT. We're asking some young people to come along who use ChatGPT and tell us about the usage. And there was a mix of people that use it and don't. By the ones that hadn't used it, when they realized what it was doing, seemed to be quite terrified of it, but all said at the end of the workshop that they would continue to use it because they saw it as now being something essential to their kind of employability skills in the future. There's a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy that goes on with this stuff as this technology becomes so central to everything that like there's a kind of almost fear of missing out if you're not up to date with it as well. Yeah, for sure. Okay, so we're moving towards our end of our time. Does anyone in the audience have a question for our panel before we maybe have an early mark? And Tao needs to go now anyway to go off and teach. Yeah. Okay, well, we'll stop it there. I really want to thank our speakers, Nick, Joel, and Tao today. It was a great start to our series. Hopefully the people that came along can come on to the other ones that we have throughout the semester. There's a link up there in the chat somewhere to our Eventbrite, but you'll be able to find those, just Newcastle Youth Studies Centre Eventbrite to kind of come along to those. But yeah, once again, thanks a lot for coming.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Dave. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks very much.
I'll have a recording of this at some stage, so I'll let you know when I have that, and I'll send you through the link if you want to use it for any of your purposes that you see fit.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thanks, Steve. Catch you later.
No, thanks so much for your time again. I really appreciate it.
No worries.
See ya. Bye. Bye, Martin.